If you allow what just happened to affect you emotionally, you guarantee that the next door will slam in your face. You have to be resilient, be unemotional. You have to accept what just happened. And the way you lead by example is you treat people with respect and dignity, and you follow the golden rule.
Welcome to another episode of Fortunate Fishes, where we believe wealth is more than money, not only financial, but intellectual, social, human, emotional, and spiritual. Our guest today is the very original Frank Rodriguez, an incredible entrepreneur, father, husband, with a very unusual way that he built his wealth, built his company. His parents came from Cuba. He was born in the U.S., and he created a company which he eventually sold for hundreds of millions of dollars. He was super original, and I think you're going to learn a lot. Please hit the subscribe button and follow us on all our social media. Well, I got to go back to the origin story on how I first met you. I showed up to a conference room. There was probably 500 people. And in the 80s, when I went to college, there was two famous guys in New York, and one is called Weird Al. He has 5 Emmys for doing parodies. Really smart guy, graduated at 16, valedictorian. And the other guy was a guy named Crazy Eddie, who was selling electronics. And we're sitting in this room, and we're taking these mandatory classes, and they're all boring. You know, people are just reading from a script. And this guy shows up, and he has a hairdo like these Frank used to have this hair that kind of just flowed, and he was in the middle of the stage, and he was engaging, and it was interesting, and everybody was interested, and he had a product that would be of value to young lawyers. And I looked around the room, and I saw 500 people. Just 10% of the people sold Frank's product to provide values for the clients. He was going to do really well. So I made an effort to go meet this guy because he looked really colorful. His name was Rodriguez. I'm a Garcia. He didn't look like a Rodriguez to me. And he probably said I didn't look like a Garcia. So that was the first time I met you, Frank. You remember those days in Palm Beach?
Yeah, when I started my business, Corporate Creations, in 1993, I was invited to make presentations for the Florida Bar for the Young Lawyers Division. And I saw it as an opportunity to get to know thousands of lawyers. I would not pitch my company while I would teach. I was a professor, and I would teach a subject that usually is taught in a very boring way. And I would teach the subject in a motivational and colorful way. I was very anecdotal. And I met every lawyer who became a member of the Florida Bar between 1993 and 14 or 15 years after that. I did it for about 15 years. And you met me in one of those classes.
Yeah, it was probably at the beginning. But what I remember is I met you back then. Everybody had business cards still. And you said you were going to follow up, and you did. And then we developed a relationship. But the reason I'm really excited that Frank's here is that, you know, Frank went to public school. He grew up, I'd say, lower to middle class. His parents were Cuban refugees. Frank was born in, I believe, in Indiana, but then
Yes,
ended up,
Indianapolis.
Indianapolis, and migrated down to Florida. And he went to college, and then he did some more education, and then he went into the professional world. And like many of us probably watching this, he really didn't like what he was doing. He hated it, actually. So he convinced his wife to keep working, and he started his little business. Like many of us, he saw something absurd that he felt that he could create a different path and provide value to people that would pay him for the service. So his wife kind of supported him. He started in a little, I guess, bedroom in your apartment.
A spare bedroom in our house.
Yeah, in your house. And slowly you grew the business. And he grew the business 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, 20% a year. And then finally, somebody knocked on his door and wrote him $100 million plus check. And after paying Uncle Sam, he did really, really well. Now, I know the company well because Frank invited me to be on the advisory board. And Frank had 2 boys, and his dream was, you know, he had this golden goose laying golden eggs, and what a beautiful thing to pass it on to your kids. I have 4 kids, and they'd probably have the same attitude like, hey, why should I go work for dad? I find what he's doing not as interesting. I want to do my own thing. So, what's interesting though is Frank has these boys that don't go into business, they become professionals, but taking the teachings of Frank, where they're doing something that they really loved and enjoyed, one of them's already become a millionaire before the age of 30. So Frank can teach people watching this podcast that want to start a business, but not everybody has that entrepreneurial gene, but everybody can work hard, go to a good school, get a good job in a place that they enjoy, and follow the lessons that Frank taught his own son to accumulate wealth and learn about compounding. So instead of starting with your kind of story, I'd love for you to start with your boys and what you taught them and how is it that, you know, one of your kids that went to work and a job that he loves was able to accumulate that kind of wealth so young.
My sons are going to turn 30 and 26. They're 4 years apart. Critical part of the story is my wife. I've been with my wife since we met in college in 1982. So we've been together for 43 years. And we've been together since the day we met the first week of college in an honors English class at the University of Miami. My wife and I both graduated from Harvard Law School together. That was like winning the lottery, except when we got there, we realized we didn't like where we were. So we
You
stuck
both
at home.
met at the University of Miami,
We
right?
met at the University of Miami the first week of college. And then we both did well in college and did well on the LSAT and went to law school together, had lived together since the early days of college and continued living together in law school. And then when we started our family, my wife became a full-time mom. And we had dinner as a family 5 or 6 nights a week. My wife's a good cook. She doesn't like to cook, but she's a good cook. And she was very type A, valedictorian in high school, straight A's in college. I thought she was going to be a mom for a couple years and then go back to a career. But she really liked being a mom and never restarted her career. So I think the family dinners that we had were an important component of how our boys evolved. I would always make time out to have dinner with the family, even if afterwards I needed to go back to my home office and continue handling some things that needed to be wrapped up that day. And I think kids appreciate when you spend time with them. Now, when they're very small, I think you have to have rules. Kids, I think, thrive when they have rules, and they flounder when they don't have rules. Now, the rules have to be flexible and they have to be fair. But for example, we prohibited television when we had dinner, and we did not allow electronics. And while our youngest son is a gamer, he likes gaming. For many years, he was one of the top League of Legends players in the world. We limited the amount of gaming that he could do, and if he did something that he shouldn't have done, we would tell him he couldn't game. And so that was a very effective way of getting him
Yeah.
to do
When
what
you
he
were
needed to.
trying, but I assume that you and Kellen were trying to instill like discipline, hard work. I mean, there's certain like table stakes to be successful in life, and certainly as an entrepreneur.
Well, we would teach things like actions have consequences. We would talk about family values. We would talk about people like Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. We did not talk to our kids like babies. We talked to our kids like adults. Our sons are very close. They talk every week. So we see our sons every month. One is on the east coast of Florida, about an hour and 20 minutes north of us, and the other one's on the west coast of Florida, about 3.5 hours from us. And so we see our sons every month. And I told them when they became independent and graduated from college that they would have one meal once a month with both of their parents. And they understood that that was not a negotiation. That's what was going to happen. But I didn't expect more than that, because if I expected them to hang out with me for 2, 3 days, then I'm
Right.
essentially imposing on their personal lives. And I always wanted them to be excited about seeing us and not seeing it as a burden. But I think to the extent you can, and you can see your kids often, I think it's helpful. It helps
Right.
you keep in touch with what's going on. All of us have ups and downs, right? Ups and downs. Wealth does not make you immune from the ups and downs of life, and to be able to see that firsthand, I think is important.
What did you teach them about the discipline around money and how to accumulate wealth and living below your means that anybody listening to this could do if they worked hard, studied, got a good job with a employer that they liked doing what they're doing, and then accumulating wealth slowly without, starting a business and being an entrepreneur?
Well, my wife and I we share values, although we have different personalities. I'm an extrovert. My wife is an introvert. And I love to travel. She travels because she knows that I love to
Right.
travel. She would just like to stay home all the time. But we do have shared values, and so I'll share what some of those shared values are that we taught our sons. We taught them the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, from my perspective, that is a spiritual concept because I was raised Catholic, but I'm agnostic. I've been agnostic since I was very young, a teenager, early days of college. My wife is non-denominational Christian, and her faith is not based on any particular religion. She believes there's a God. She doesn't know the nature of God, but she believes there's a God. She believes Jesus is the Son of God, but never a participant in any religious organization. Considers himself to be non-denominational Christian. So, because of that common foundation, my wife and I both are familiar with the Golden Rule. I think most people are familiar with the Golden
Sure.
Rule, whether they have faith or not, and regardless of their faith. And I think that's the foundation for all human interaction that is positive. And I think that the breakdown of human interactions where things become negative are at their root of failure to follow the golden rule. So that's actually one of our family values. Our family has created a list of family values. We have a list of 10 family values that we came up with together. We meet every year on December 26th, and we begin our family meeting with a discussion of the family values. We've been doing this for 8 years.
For somebody watching this who is a young kid in his 20s, who is thinking, how do I, maybe they didn't have the education that your kids had with you and Kellen, but you've learned how to accumulate wealth beyond just, obviously, if you have a son who's a smart kid working in a great company, he somehow learned to invest his capital well, right?
Yes, we've taught our sons about finance and economics. I, my perspective on money is perhaps different than
Okay.
that of others you've spoken with. I'm not driven by money. I never have been. I'm driven by freedom. So for me, money is freedom. That's all it is. I've always lived below my means. Now, I'm at a stage of my life where I have things that most people don't have, but I don't get any pleasure from expensive bottles of wine. I don't get pleasure from fancy things.
For you, it was about freedom. You wanted the freedom that financial capital could give you. You weren't
Do what I
explicitly
want, when I want, with whom I want. Yeah, that's and I think if you do that, and if you treat people pursuant the golden rule, and when I say people, I mean everyone you interact with. Over time, if you provide something of value, uh, you're going to do well financially. And if you try and do it quickly, you're going to make a lot of bad decisions. There are a lot of people who obtain financial success very quickly, and they lose it just as quickly. There are other people who obtain financial success by over leveraging. I'm not a fan of debt. I have used debt in the past, but for example, I currently have no debt. I own my house without a mortgage. I own my cars without debt. My sons are the same way. My sons have no debt. And while there's a place for debt in the growth of a business, if you need working capital at some point in time, I think that if you focus on money and if that's what's driving you, you're going to make a lot of bad decisions. And if you focus on other values that are important to you, In my case, it's freedom and following the golden rule. I think you're going to be able to compound your gains over time, and that is how you create long lasting wealth.
And obviously, you've taught your sons that if they're in a professional environment working for a company and they're providing 3 or 4x the value that's expected of them and they treat everyone with the golden rule, they're going to advance probably quicker than others. And if they're living below their means and then investing, and what are the products? Because I think you also have kept it simple in investing in index funds. And have your sons followed kind of your investing pattern as well?
Yes, my sons save half their income.
That, that's what I was looking for. That's
My sons are software
incredible.
engineers. My sons are making low six figures as software engineers, and they save half their income, and they then dollar cost average that income into Vanguard ETFs. It could be Fidelity ETFs. There's many ETFs out there. I taught them that while it's good to buy Vanguard ETFs, they should not broker with Vanguard because Vanguard they have a low cost model, and so the service you get on the brokerage side is not the level of quality you get with a Fidelity or a Schwab. And so I've taught them these things. They each have their own brokerage accounts. I taught them how to do that. I taught them how to navigate these brokerage accounts.
How old were they when they were doing that, Frank? How old were they when you taught them these things?
Well, I started teaching them this when they were roughly 18 and 22, roughly. Well, the financial aspect. So, I think getting into the details of some of the things that I just said in the last few minutes,
Right.
it is not appropriate for someone who's 12. Um, they they may struggle with some of the concepts, and I think they're too young. And also, we started having family meetings when my wife and I concluded that both of her sons are mature. In the case of my oldest son, he was mature the day he was born. In the case of my youngest son, he was a very complicated kid until he turned 18, and now he's easy. But kids come out the way they come out, and I think as parents, we need to be understanding the fact that they're not going to be the same, and we need to kind of help mold them so that we can play on their strengths and help them understand that we're all imperfect. So we waited until our kids were 18 and 22 to start having our first family meeting, which is when we started to have getting into. I run those meetings like a board meeting. We meet from 10 to 6. We have lunch together.
Do you do these meetings quarterly or a couple times a
No, we
year?
do this meeting once a year.
Okay.
We do it on December 26th because my family celebrates Christmas, and our sons come and visit us every November and every December. And then the other months of the year, we visit them. And since they're already at the house, they're at the home in Jupiter where we live. It's easy to have the family meeting on December 26th, and that's become our tradition. But before that, we've been traveling with our sons since my oldest son was 1 year old. So our sons, by the time they were 18 and 22, they had been on all 7 continents. So I believe in shared experiences, and I think that one of the ways that families bond is through shared experiences. It doesn't have to be travel. It could be sports. It could be something else. But our family, our DNA is shared experiences. And last year, for example, we went to Bhutan, south of Tibet and north of India. It's a wonderful spiritual place. And when we travel, when we take these family trips, our sons select where we go. And they know that when we have our family meeting at the end of the agenda, they get an agenda the way you would get at a board meeting. And at the end of the agenda, the very last line item says family trip. And our sons know that we're going to look to them and say, where would you like to go? And wherever they pick, that's where we go.
That is awesome. And I just came back yesterday with my daughter from a trip to Tibet in that area, in the Himalayas. It was a spiritual retreat. And I think going as a family or going one-on-one with your kids really deepens it. But I want to go back because, Warren Buffett says compounding is like the eighth wonder of the world. You're a smart guy and a really good teacher. And just do the math. If somebody's working and making, let's say, a couple $100,000 a year, and they're saving $100,000 and investing the way that you're telling your sons to invest, walk through like, what is compounding? Why do people don't get it? And do the math on what happens when you're saving half of your income and it compounds in the type of ETFs that you're talking about.
Okay, well, before we talk about compounding, if you take 50,000 a year and you save 50,000 a year for 10 years, at the end of those 10 years, you have $500,000. So now you're half a millionaire. Now let's take compound. So in year one, you save 50, and then depending on, there's something called the rule of 72. So the rule of 72 tells you the number of years that it takes to compound any asset at a given rate of interest. So if you're making a 5% return per year, it's going to take you around 15 years to double that money. If you compound at 7% a year, it's going to take you 10 years. So it's a very simple formula. You can do the math in your head. It gives you a rough estimate of how long it takes to compound. Our family has a mission statement. And one of the missions of our family, which is in writing, and we talk about it every year when we have our family meeting, is to double family assets every 10 years after the payment of taxes. And by taxes, I mean taxes on realized gains. So taxes on dividends, taxes on interest, and taxes on realized gains. And so that's our goal. So to achieve that, we have to achieve a return as a family of the money that I manage with the assistance of my wife and our sons, because they're on the investment committee. Although I'm the chief investment officer, we have to achieve that goal, that mission. I have to achieve an average return of 7% or greater per year to double the money every 10. We've achieved that across all asset classes. And so I'm a simplifier. So some people are complicators. I'm not a complicator. I'm a simplifier. When I was in business growing corporate creations, I measured one thing: realized gross profit, revenue minus cost of goods or cost of services. And I only measured cash in, cash out. So I didn't measure accrual. I measured cash in, cash out. And my goal was to grow that number at 15% a year. And if I did that, I was going to double my money every 3 to 5 years.
But you're actually growing at 20%, right? Average?
We averaged 15 to 30%. And where we were in that range depended on the year. We did that for almost 30 years in the business. And so I've applied that concept that I took in my business. In my business, we measured realized gross profit. And I ran an open books company. So everyone in my business, everyone, including the secretary that got hired the day before yesterday, knew our monthly realized gross profit. And then we bonused off that number. In my family, I measure assets. So I have a reporting system that I designed because I didn't like the reporting systems that were available out there in the world. And so I designed my own reporting system. And that reporting system I share with my family periodically. And that reporting system has a tab in it called change in assets. And so my family can track every time they get this report whether we're above 7% or below 7% after taxes. And right now we're above 8%. And we've sustained that for the amount of time I've been managing the money, which is 6 years, because I sold my company about 6 years ago. And before that, I was focused on my business. I had almost all my assets in one thing, my business.
Again, I want to make sure that people that are watching this, that are young, understand this concept before we go into your whole business. If you look at the S&P 500 over the last 10 years, and if you just put your money in the S&P 500 Vanguard Index, I think the average return is about 15% for like 10 years, which under the rule of 72, it means you're doubling in 5 years.
You're going to double twice.
Right. So if you're investing 50,000, half of your income over 10 years, and it's probably that half is probably going to be also growing over 10 years.
You'll have $200,000. 50 grows to 100, goes to 200.
Right. But
In
if
10
you're
years.
putting, right. And if you're putting in 50 a year, for 10 years or half of your income and it's growing at 15%, so it's going to double twice, by that end of 10 years, you're going to get to that $1 million a lot quicker than 10 years.
My son got there in 7.
Right. In 7 years. So I just don't think that people have that discipline of living beyond their means, saving. So by the time that your son, who's not even 30 yet, is 55, he's going to have that financial freedom where he could actually pull the ripcord and probably retire in his 40s.
So it's about deferred gratification. So most people struggle with this. Most people have a difficult time with deferred gratification. They want gratification now. And that's a very short-sighted way of looking at the world. Related to the issue of deferred gratification is that a lot of people define themselves through the opinions of others. And in my family, all of us are aligned on this. The only opinions that matter are the opinions of people we like, trust, and respect. And the opinions of people we don't like, trust, and respect are irrelevant. And what happens in society is a lot of people allow themselves to be defined by others who they don't even know, or who they don't like, or who they don't trust, or who they don't respect. And it causes them to do things for show. They have a fancy car that they're leasing because they can't afford to buy it, so that the neighbor thinks that they have wealth. And all of these, in my family, all of these things are irrelevant. And by embracing deferred gratification, by embracing the idea that our identity is created by us and those we like, trust, and respect, you develop the discipline to focus on what matters and ignore what doesn't matter. And it makes the world more zen and quieter and less volatile.
Right. And even if you weren't a software engineer, if you were in any profession and you could say 15, 20,000 a year and do the same strategy, it'll take you a little bit longer, but you're going to get there. So maybe it's not 7 years, maybe it's 14 years or 15 years, but still before the age of 40, over a 20-year period, you could have 3 or 4 of those doubles that's going to get you there through compounding.
Yes. Yeah, now, this is assuming you have a job and you have an income and you're living in a $2,000 a month apartment and not a $5,000 a month apartment. And you're driving a Honda, which is what my oldest son drives, and he's not driving a Lamborghini. Now, my oldest son can buy a Lamborghini cash, but he drives a Honda. And when he bought his first car with his own money, I said, why did you buy that brand of Honda instead of the more expensive brand of Honda? And he said to me, because my surfboard fits in the one that I bought. And so he was driven by, where does the surfboard fit? And so I high-fived my wife because we had achieved the objective. He was focusing on the stuff that matters.
Awesome. So now I want to go back into the your entrepreneurial journey, because you went to public high school, right? In Miami.
Lakes High School.
Yeah. So you went to a public school, you worked hard, and then you got into the University of Miami, met your wife, and you've said how important it is to find the right partner, because that could certainly take you astray if you don't have the right partner. And then you go to Harvard Law School, both. Obviously, you're a smart guy, but neither you nor Kellen really liked the practice law. So tell us about how you ended up coming up with this idea of looking at something absurd that you could provide a different solution to, and the courage to just go off on your own and do it.
So I went to college at 18. I graduated at 22. I graduated law school at 25. And I started my company at 28. And in between 25 and 28, I was working in a large law firm. At the time, it was the second largest law firm in Florida, measured by number of lawyers. And my wife worked at the largest law firm in Palm Beach County. I was a corporate mergers and acquisitions lawyer. My wife was a real estate lawyer. So we were both what are called transactional. We were not litigators. And when I was a young lawyer, which I did for 3 years, there was a sandwich shop that I would eat at once or twice a week. I would buy my sandwich at the sandwich shop. It was a tiny sandwich shop. There weren't any tables in it. And I would then take the sandwich back to my office and I would have lunch. The owners of this sandwich shop were both engineers. They were professional engineers. They worked at a large company called Pratt and Whitney. And I knew that. And admired them because they had the courage to quit those jobs and start a little business, little deli. And so we were friendly. And the name of this couple is Mike and Ali Arnell. And they changed my life. And the way they changed my life is one day they showed up to my office. They knew they knew my name. I knew their names, and they just showed up in my office. They didn't have an appointment. And they started asking me questions about incorporating their unincorporated business. They were operating as an unincorporated general partnership, which is the worst way to run a business in the United States, but they didn't know. And so I was giving them advice on how they should run their business from a structural standpoint. And they had some tax questions that I was able to answer them. And Mike brought his checkbook with him. And he literally opened his checkbook and said, how much is this going to cost, this thing we just talked about? And I quoted him my hourly rate because that's all I needed to do. It
And
didn't
what was
occur to
your
me,
hourly rate back then?
oh, I don't know, 150 an hour, 125 an hour. I was a young associate. This is in 1990, 1991. It was a long time ago. Mike said, Frank, you don't understand my question. I don't want to know your hourly rate. How much is this going to cost? Well, I didn't know. So I said, well, Mike, I got to look into this for you because I don't know the answer the way you would like it described. It's a very reasonable question you've asked. And let me get back to you. So can you come back to my office tomorrow at the same time? So we agreed to do that. And I went to an attorney a few years older than me, a tax lawyer, who I was friendly with. And he said to me back in what this story, back in 40 years ago, he said to me, well, tell them $850. Well, that's a crazy number. I mean, that's like $2,500, $3,000 to incorporate a little deli business. But I didn't know. I was naive, and most managers of law firms do not teach their young associates about the economics of the practice of law, often because they themselves don't understand the economics of the practice of law. Lawyers tend to be mediocre business people. Now, there's exceptions to that, and there are some very successful business people who have law backgrounds. The people who practice law for a living generally don't have a sense of the economics of
But
anything.
but just to be clear, these guys came to you and said, we need to incorporate our business properly. Can you help us? And what's it going to cost? Basically.
Yes.
And
And they came
then,
back the next day, and I said, with a big smile, I said, $2,500. Mike and his wife stood up and started walking out of my office. And I was confused. I was 28 or so. I was confused. I didn't understand why he was walking out of my office. And I said, Mike, what's wrong? And he turned around at the threshold of my doorway and said, Frank, I don't like being ripped off. And he left. And so for a few minutes, I felt bad. I thought I had messed up. And the longer I thought about what had happened, I concluded that what had happened to me happened every day all over the country.
so it was something, an absurdity that you said, this is freaking
Yes.
absurd.
And I experienced the problem firsthand. I
Hurt you.
decided
It went against your values too, right?
it went against my values because quoting that amount of money for a little deli made no sense. And I decided that I was going to automate the process of forming companies in the United States. And I was going to solve the problem. And that's what I did.
And can you describe like the complexity of doing this at that time in Florida before like even going anywhere else?
Well, what would happen is, for those who are younger than you and I, it's important to understand that in 1993, uh, very few people in the world had ever heard of the internet. Almost no one in the world had an
Right.
email account.
Right. Right.
The largest email provider in the United States was actually a subsidiary of the tax preparation company called H&R Block, called CompuServe. CompuServe was the largest email provider in the United States. The web browser we use today did not exist because no one used the internet. And so I happened to start my business in 1993, January 1993, after having spent 3 years helping my supervising partner write a book. Now, at the time, I wasn't very happy that I was writing this book because it was unclear whether I was getting credit for it. So I sort of had two jobs. I had my job as a lawyer, billing hours, and I had a job that I was told I was being given credit for, but I was kind of skeptical of this because I had to edit and write this book. And I edited every chapter of this book. I wrote some of the chapters of this book. And while writing this book, while participating in the writing of this, I learned about a very obscure law that had been passed by the Florida legislature in 1992 that no one knew about. And this law was like 10 words long. And the law created what's called electronic filing of corporate documents. And prior to this law, in order to do anything involving the life cycle of an entity, you had to live in Tallahassee. And Tallahassee is in North Florida. It's far away from the center of populations within the state. I lived in Palm Beach County. I lived probably 6 or 7 hours from Tallahassee. And so to start corporate creations in 1990 would have required me to move to Tallahassee. I started corporate creations in 1993, several months after the passage of this law, which enabled me to form companies remotely from anywhere.
Right. So that was an incredible kind of thing that happened because you saw the opportunity. But before that, what you're saying is you would have to have an office in Tallahassee and you'd have to fill out papers or send faxes or however it was.
No, you'd
And
walk in the documents, you would counterfile.
how long would that whole process take?
Longer than when I started my company in 1993.
And then lawyers bill by the hour, not typically a flat fee either, right? To start a company?
Yes, lawyers bill by the hour. But what I did is I started wholesaling corporation services. So I would, during the daytime, I used to wear a headset because I was on the phone all day. I'd dial for dollars. I'd call lawyers and I'd tell them, "Hey, you're a real estate lawyer. You probably form only a few companies per year, and uh, you're making your money off real estate transactions, not forming companies. So I'll wholesale to you. I'll give you a wholesale price. Private label the documents for you so no one knows my company's involved. And you'll make more money by having corporate creations form the company than you will by doing it yourself."
And what was the difference in price, Frank, at that time? For if you were calling me, the difference in time and price versus doing it with you?
Well, we would wholesale companies at including state filing fees for 250 compared to 2,500.
Now, I've opened probably 20 companies over 30 years. I've always done them with your
So
firm, and
that was us wholesaling to the lawyers.
right. But I remember that basically within either 24 or 48 hours, I got the books, the names, the bylaws, the whole thing.
We became one of the fastest incorporators in the United States, and we developed systems. So we became experts at data systems. I became a self-taught database programmer. I did that at night, and then over time, my goal as an entrepreneur was to replicate myself, so
Right.
that the things I did, I no longer did them. Other people.
Right. Now, but go back to how, before you came around and maybe before the law, how long would it take to incorporate a company and what
It
was
could take
kind
a
of the
week.
average and what was the cost?
850.
Got it. So you got it down to like 250.
25% of that number.
Got it. And so if you went to a lawyer and the lawyer had a client, you were charging him the 250 and then he can add on whatever he wanted.
Yeah, they could charge 600 and everybody wins.
Right.
So the natural state of a free market and a true free market is almost non-existent. But the true state of a free market is deflation. In a truly free market, prices go down because what happens when you have a free market is there's innovation. And when there's innovation, prices drop. And and that's what I did. And I'm an economics major. I understood that. And I was in an industry that for 100 years was a duopoly controlled by two major players who had as clients every single Fortune 1000 in the United States. And by the time I sold my company, we had 150 of those.
Right. And I was on the board of Winn-Dixie when I was 44, and I was amazed when you and I talked because, you think, well, it's one company and, it's $250. Explain how a company like a Winn-Dixie that has supermarkets, it wasn't just one corporation.
Because my company was in the entity solutions business, and that involves the life cycle of an entity, which includes serving as registered agent. In the United States, the formation of entities is done at the state level. In some countries, it's done at the federal level, but in the United States, it's done at the state level. We have 50 states in the District of Columbia. All of those jurisdictions have their own rules, their own price structures, and it's difficult for someone to be efficient in navigating all of the states unless they do it all the time, unless they
Right.
specialize.
Right, I understand. But going back to a Winn-Dixie, if Winn-Dixie had 1,000 stores, if somebody slipped and fell on any of those stores and wanted to sue them, they'd have to have every store as a registered agent, right? So instead of one unit, you'd have like 1,000, right? Something like
Right.
that.
Companies, whether private or public, usually have companies that are larger, usually have more than one entity registered in more than one state. And so a unit is defined as one entity in one state. So if you have one entity and it's registered in all the states, that's 51 units if you include the District of Columbia. Our average accounts that were large were worth between 20,000 and 100,000 a year. And in my business, if you took all of our income streams, including charging an annual fee per company, per state, per annual report, per service or process. So I've just described that my company had 3 recurring incomes, 3. And that's why this business was very profitable. So when I sold my company for 17 times EBITDA a week before the pandemic hit the United States, I sold it to a client, and this client liked the fact that we had 3 recurring incomes and we had broken a duopoly that had existed for 100 years. And they understood that our gross margins were 60%. So my company had gross margins of 60% and net margins of over 30%. So my company was a cash machine.
Truly the golden goose laying golden eggs.
And I wouldn't have sold it unless someone offered me a high multiple, because
Right.
when interest rates are low, asset values inflate, and when interest rates go up, asset values deflate. So to make a multiple of 17 times EBITDA, and in my business, EBITDA and net profit were roughly the same number.
You made a conscious decision at some point that you weren't going to be a history major or an architect major or a fluffy whatever. You
A
studied,
fluffy?
yeah, you
What's a
studied
fluffy?
economics. Fluffy, or I'm going to be a anthropology major, whatever. Like economics is considered STEM. You know, but you got to work harder to be an economics major than.
Well, not as hard as a chemistry major.
No, not true. But tell me the importance of that, because not only obviously you were a lawyer, most lawyers aren't business people, but you had a background in numbers and finance that had to be extremely helpful as an entrepreneur because you knew this stuff. And maybe not economic, like, my son went to Babson, so he studied more entrepreneurship, but it was heavy math, accounting. You had the foundations that you would need.
So there's an element of truth to what you said, but I would like those who listen to this podcast to understand that what we learn outside of college is many times more important than what we learn in college, or at least in the classroom. So what I learned in college was I learned this also before college, is how to read and how to do basic math. So in life, we have to read. And by reading, I mean that you comprehend what you've read. And more important, actually, than reading and doing math, which I think are really the base, is the ability to communicate and the ability to develop relationships and the ability to understand that the way I get the way I achieve success is I help you achieve your dreams. And these concepts are not taught generally in the classroom. These concepts are taught by people we meet in life who mentor us informally, usually. It's usually not a formal process, or books we read that change our lives. And every area in the United States has a library. And now we have the internet. Back when I was
And what are
younger,
some of those books, Frank, that you would say, hey, if you read these 3 or 4 books, they're going to really help you be successful in any walk of life. If you're a business person, entrepreneur.
well, on the issue of relationships, I think everybody should read How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. It's a timeless classic. Everyone should read this book. On the issue of understanding the details of this concept that the way I achieve my dreams is I help you achieve your dreams, is a book written by Robert Cialdini called Influence. It's a book about the concept of persuasion. In my opinion, all human interactions are an exercise in persuasion.
And his further book, Persuasion, is unbelievable. I bought it for all my kids. It's like,
So I recommend both of those books. Both of those books by Cialdini, and then Waken, and then also How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And I think that resilience is an important element of success. I know a lot of people are smarter than I am, but they're not resilient.
what does it mean to you, Frank? Because I agree with you. And I think it's one of the most important things we can teach our
Well,
kids.
you've probably heard the word grit. So grit and resilience are similar concepts. Life can beat us up, and it beats everybody up. Some people more than others, because we were fortunate enough to have been born in the United States. As Warren Buffett says, we were all born on third base, to use a baseball metaphor. But even those of us who are born in the United States, we still get beat up. Sometimes we make mistakes with people and we get beat up emotionally. Sometimes we make mistakes with investments and we get beat up by losing money. Hopefully we've learned the lesson of diversification and investment so that the amount of money is painful but doesn't bankrupt us. Wealth does not make anyone immune from pain and the roller coaster ride of life. And perseverance is the ability to get knocked down, standing back up, dusting yourself off, and moving forward. And a lot of people have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
They become bitter, which is the opposite of what you need to do when you're resilient. And they don't understand that the knocks and the failures are experiences for learning, right?
Yeah.
These things that happen to us are learning moments.
Yeah.
And
And that's what I tell my kids, that failure doesn't exist if you learn one thing. And one of the things I did with my youngest, I wish I would have done with all 4, was, I'd go pray with my youngest at night. And on like Tuesday, I had a prayer that she just absolutely hated. And we prayed for a spectacular failure week. And on Friday, I would say, how did you fail? And the bigger the failure, the bigger the high five. I hugged her. I said, I love you. When you're failing, you're learning. What did you learn from that? Awesome. That's great. She hated it. But today, she is like fearless because she knows doesn't matter. Like, she's going to learn. And I wish I would have done that with all the
that's a great idea.
kids.
Yeah. Tomorrow's a new day.
Yeah, and it's not how it's like how to react to it and how you can savor it, because we usually learn more from our failures than our successes, but that resilience is important. I want to go back to another thing. You have a lot of superpowers, but I think you can really help people. When you were at law school, even though you didn't particularly enjoy it, you did have a class with the very famous professor Roger Fisher. Tell us about that and what you learned from it and what you can teach people about what you learned from him.
Well, on the list of books that I recommend, I would add Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher, which he co-wrote with a professor who he mentored. I disliked almost every moment of law school. My wife disliked almost every moment of law school more than me. But there was one exception for me. I took a course by Roger Fisher. Roger Fisher has since passed away. But I was in law school from 1989 until 1992. And when I was in my second year of law school, I took a course called the Harvard Negotiation Workshop. And this was a class on negotiation. And the class was based on the principles in this very small 100-page book called Getting to Yes. That was one of the transformational moments of my life. In this class and reading this book, I learned about a type of negotiation called principled negotiation. So most people are positional bargainers. Our current president in the United States is a positional bargainer.
And what is that?
A positional bargainer is someone who begins the negotiation with an extreme position, and some people are more extreme than others. And our current president, I think, is among the most extreme. This is just a style of negotiation.
That's what he says. Like in Gaza, he wants to buy the whole property and build a Trump resort or something.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Something totally out of left field.
Yes, or worse. I mean,
Right.
And when someone is a positional bargainer, when they're that extreme, no one believes them because they're saying things that are absurd. And so what I learned is, and I'm a principal negotiator, so I like efficiency. It's my personality. I like to move fast. I'm a very fast decision maker. I like to move fast.
We like to get to know fast. If it's going to be a no, don't waste.
I like to get to know fast, or I like to get the yes fast.
Right.
I don't like to mess around with maybe very long.
Right.
So I'm a principal negotiator. So what I do is I negotiate with my cards up. If we were playing a game like poker, in poker, some of your cards are down and some of your cards are up, depending on the style. I play with all my cards up.
But that means, Frank, that if you're going and when you're negotiating, it's typically very emotional. And in your case, you do a lot of preparation. You're thinking already what's your objective. You're doing things to prepare before even going. You're not just going on cold.
Let's say you and I are going to negotiate. Before we have the conversation, I'm going to think very deeply about what is my alternative if we don't reach a negotiated outcome. That's called a BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Some people call it a plan B. And so before we have our first conversation, I already have my BATNA, my plan B. And it has to be a solid plan B that I embrace and that I support and that I'm willing to pursue. And I have to be.
And why is that important emotionally?
Because it makes me unemotional.
Right.
And in a principled negotiation, the less emotional you are, the more leverage and power you have. But you have to go through the process of preparation and you have to think through what is it that you want, and what it is you want becomes your opening position.
And can you give us just an example that you could make up to make it more real?
I'm selling a house. You're buying the house. I'm going to price my house at the price that I'm willing to sell it at, a price that I think is fair. I'm not going to give you a higher price. And what's going to happen is if I truly give the fair price, you're not going to negotiate that price with me. You're going to pay me the amount I asked for. And I'm going to sell the house in a week instead of 6 months.
Right. And if I come in and let's say you wanted to sell it for $250, but I was like pushing, I'm only going to buy it for $200 or $180. What's your BATNA?
Well, in the case of a house, one example of a BATNA is that I stay in the house. Another example of a BATNA is let's say I'm required to move. Let's say I have a job somewhere and I have to move to Idaho, which is far from Florida where I live.
Right.
Or my wife has a career pursuing something in Idaho and we have to move. Then my BATNA is I'm going to rent the house. So either I'm going to stay in the house or I'm going to rent the house. Those are two examples.
Got it. Yeah. And it could be obviously more complex if you're selling a business or other type of things.
When I give you my price, I'm going to give you information to help you make an informed decision. I'm going to give you comparables. I'm going to help you get to yes easy. I've done my homework. I'm not just going to give you a number. Positional bargainers do no work, no research. They just throw out a crazy number, hoping that you're going to reach. So they want $500,000, but they want 500,000, but they're going to start at $1 million, and you're going to start at 200. And at the end of the day,
And
you're going to split the
and
baby. And
that's the split the
I want to
difference
avoid
then.
all of that.
So Frank, so you would come in and say, "Hey, look, in the last 12 months, there's been 12 sales in this neighborhood. Here it is. You can see the average of those sales just happens to be
My number.
250, which I think is a fair number. Um, and you would they would get a sense from you that you're being fair, reasonable.
Yes,
You're not hiding anything.
correct.
And if they push you around, which they'll do, they'll see you're unemotional and
I don't do
friendly.
the
Hey,
deal.
yeah, hey, this is it. And if you don't want it, then that's okay. They'll be, hey, another BATNA is you just keep it on the market longer, and if it's not them, it'll be somebody else.
And what happens a lot of times when you approach life the way I'm describing is people are sometimes confused because most people are positional bargainers. They're a little skeptical that you actually give them a fair price. And what happens sometimes is they leave and then they come back the next day and they say, "Hey, look, I thought about I thought about the comparables you gave me, and I think you did offer a fair price, and that's what I want to pay you."
And you'd probably also have, hey, here's all the work I've done in the house. Here's an estimate.
Yes.
There's no, termites. There's no mold.
So I'm a relationship person. That's one of my values. And I believe that the principal negotiation approach is the best way to preserve and grow relationships.
Right. So another one of your superpowers, which negotiations is one, is I don't like the word networking, but you know a lot of people. If I call people and ask about you in the community, they're going to have good things to say about, oh yeah, Frank, he's a good guy. And if your friends call you, you will help them.
Yes,
But also if you ask people for help and they don't, you know, carry through the way that you would carry through in a relationship, they're not worthy of being in your
I don't
circle.
spend any more time with them. So I think in life it's important to teach our kids that and to internalize for ourselves that you need to be willing to ask for help. Some people are not willing to ask for help. You have to be willing to ask for help throughout your lifetime in all different kinds of areas. But in order to be balanced in life and have equilibrium, you have to be willing to give help. So what I find is that the people who are most willing to give help to others are the ones who are the most enthusiastic about asking for help. And that's because you're at equilibrium.
I I have, as you know, I love helping people. I have like one of the widest networks, but for some reason I do find it hard to ask for help. I mean, I have a relationship with you, and if I need help, I'm gonna call you, but it costs me. And I think maybe the way I grew up and my way my father was in Latin America, you rely on family. I'm getting better at it. Your frame is, hey, you help everybody that's in your network. So then why should you not ask them for help if you need it? But it
Yes, that's
takes,
how I
you got to
view.
be, but there's some vulnerability because, you have to, obviously it depends what you're asking for as well. But another one of your superpowers, I think that you may underestimate and which is vital in life is you're a really good salesperson in a professional way, sales, or just getting what you want in a non-professional way, because you're always selling, whether it's your kids, your spouse. Talk to us about the importance of sales, and particularly also, obviously, you said you had a headphone on and you were calling lawyers all the time. You were getting a lot of rejections also.
Yes.
Tell us about, because you are a really good salesperson, and that's something you need to be good at in life also.
Well, the way we get good at anything is we practice. And as we practice, we fail. And when we do something enough times, eventually we get really good at it. And now, look, there are limits, right? So I could practice being a high jumper, but I'm 5'7", and I'm probably not going to be a world class high jumper. But in terms of soft skills like sales, the way you get good at it is you practice and you accept rejection. So I started my journey selling when I was a teenager. My father, to supplement our family income, would sell cable television door to door. So back in the 1970s, no one knew what cable television was. It was modern technology. No one knew what it was. And so the way it was sold is there were sales teams, most of whom were part time. My father was a part time salesman, literally going door to door and knocking on doors and asking for permission to enter the home to talk about cable TV. And I worked with a company called Dynamic Cablevision, and my father helped me get a part time job there. And so the way I started learning how to sell was watching my father knock on a door and having the person slam the door. And what I learned by watching my father is now we have to walk to the next house. And during that short trip from the house where the door just got slammed to the next house, my father would say to me, if you allow what just happened to affect you emotionally, you guarantee that the next door will slam in your face. So you have to be resilient and you have to be unemotional and you have to accept what just happened. If you don't smile, you have no chance of ever getting in that house. And so when you do that over the course of a few hours, you realize the wisdom in what my father told me. And my father was brilliant at a negative experience and go to the next house. And it's as though that experience didn't even happen. And so I learned at a very young age by practicing, by selling cable television door to door. When
Wow.
I was in college, I had to supplement. So I didn't have a full scholarship. I had a 75% scholarship and I needed to make some extra cash. So I would sell um, solar water heater systems. And I did this part time. And you have to be willing to accept rejection.
And was that also knocking on doors?
No, solar water heater systems involved a small company that had people who would make phone calls and they would generate what are called leads, people who express interest over the phone. And then as one of the people who would visit the leads, I had a lead and that's how I would.
Right. And when I built the business, we were also I had a whole room dialing and they would on average dial 300 times to get 5 people a day to say they were interested. And at the end of the week, if they had 5 a day, 25, they would get two. So they would call 1,500 times to get two. And then we have a mutual friend, Don Wenner. He would sell door to door and he was real estate. He had to get 50 no's, door slammed in his face to get one sale. So he learned to get to know quickly and he knew if he could get in the house, he had a shot, but it was still 50 rejections to every. So you learn not to be upset with.
And not to give up. Yeah, because a lot of people give up right before they're about to succeed.
I know I'm sure you read a lot of books. You had a lot of training. You had your dad teaching you. You probably learned from other people. But what are some of the top kind of takeaways? And you probably just do it so naturally that have made you successful talking to people and getting them to buy.
Well, the best salespeople uh, are the ones who ask the most questions. The parody of a salesperson is the used car salesman, the fast talker, a little slick, but that is not the professional paradigm of a salesperson. The salesperson is someone who's a good listener and who's good at asking questions and listening to the answers. And in going through that process, what you're learning is whether the person you're having conversation with is even a candidate for what you're doing. So if you using the example of cable television, if I knock on a door and they don't own a television, they're not a candidate for cable television. So why am I going to spend time uh, trying to persuade someone who doesn't even have a television? And so I think that people who are effective at sales are relationship builders. They ask questions, they listen, and they understand profoundly that to achieve their dream, they help you achieve your dream. So by helping you, they help themselves. And a
Yeah.
lot of people look at the world the other way. A lot of people are all about me, what's going to help me. And that is, in my experience, not the most effective way of interacting with other people. It's how do I help you? How can I help you? And sometimes I can't help you because the thing that I have to offer is not of interest to you.
Right. And let's go back to the beginning because there's also the you have a overarching value on top of that, which is the golden rule. So how does that come into play in sales for you?
Well, I'm only going to do a deal that is a win-win. As a principal negotiator, we don't do win-lose deals. So if it's going to be a win-lose deal, I'm not doing the deal. It's got to be a win-win because win-lose deals always unravel, always. An unraveling could be a lawsuit. An unraveling could be um, reputational because people who get burned are going to tell 10 people. We're going to tell 10 people.
And the opposite is if you have a win-win, they're also going to tell people when
That's right.
people come to their homes and they got a great cable system, they're going to say, "Oh, no, you got to call Frank." Frank.
Well, in today's society, I think society has become too distant from one another. I
Yeah.
think technology, while it's a tool, I'm a technologist, but sometimes it gets in the way of relationship building. And so, especially today, there's actually a multiplier effect when you approach things win-win. And so instead of telling 10 people, they're going to tell 20. So if they have a bad experience, they'll tell 10. If they have a good experience, they're going to tell 20 because it's so shocking nowadays to run across someone who actually cares about their job and cares about excellence and cares about quality. I think things are different now than they were 30 years ago
Right.
when I started my company. So
Right.
if you can focus on win-win negotiations with everybody. So I ran my business for 30 years. You know how many employment disputes I had? Zero. None.
And I want to go into that because of what you did, and I want to go into also you built this goose laying golden eggs, and you were competing against two
Monsters.
huge predators
Yes.
that could gobble you up and crush you at any time. And you started from this, little space and grew a company. And your business principles, the way you hired people, the way that you bonus people, the way that you let people go if there wasn't fit were very unusual. I mean, I haven't really experienced or seen it anywhere. So I'd like you to just talk about your company, your processes, what made you different, why did you do it that way, and why did it make what you were doing special?
There are two leadership styles. I'm oversimplifying, but there's two leadership styles. There's people who lead by fear. Those leadership styles can sometimes have short-term success, but eventually end in failure. And there's the way I lead, which is you lead by example. And the way you lead by example is you treat people with respect and dignity, and you follow the golden rule. So when I built my company, I built a company based on the kind of place where I would want to be an employee. I was the owner, but I would always ask myself, if I was an employee, is this something that I would embrace? I'll give you some examples of some of the things I did. So I read a book by Jim Collins called Good to Great. In this book, there's a chapter called First Who Then What. There's a metaphor of a bus. You put the right people on the bus, you get the wrong people off the bus. And when you have the right people on the bus, you have to put the right people in the right seats. It's a wonderful metaphor. And as a leader, if you fail to put the people in the right seats, or if you fail to keep the wrong people on the bus, it's your fault. It's not the fault of the person you hired. It's your fault. It's your fault for not assessing them, for not realizing that they're wrong, for not realizing they're toxic, for not realizing they lack a set of skills that are necessary to do the job. It could be attitudinal skills or it could be the skills of actually doing the job. In my company, we never fired anybody. We invited them to resign. Now, it sounds like a semantic difference, but it's actually a profound philosophical difference. Because when you fire someone, you're blaming them, you're pointing at them, you're saying it's your fault, you did wrong, you're bad. When you invite them to resign, you're saying it's not a good fit, and they will agree with you.
If they said why, you would just keep saying, look,
You never tell them why it's not a good fit, because they will agree that it's not a good fit. but they will not agree with why it's not a good fit.
You don't want them defensive.
You want them to be unemotional. Why? Because unemotional people do not call their best friend from high school, who's a lawyer, on the way home.
Right.
And so
What
it's
else did you
about
do?
risk management.
Right. As part of the process, again, because of your negotiation, you'd all thought this through carefully. So, well, I'm sitting with you. I've been with you 90 days, 6 months. I'm not a good fit. So, what else happens during that?
Okay, right before, toward the middle of my business career in corporate creations, I stopped doing what I'm about to describe. I taught other people how to do it. But let's say I was doing it, and you are the member of my team, and so I'm the one having the conversation with you. So
There's someone else in the room too, right?
always,
Okay.
always. And if I'm meeting with a woman, the other person in the room is a woman. Always. Okay. So, and before you walk into the room, I've called someone on my IT team, and your access to the computer system has been eliminated. So as you're walking from your computer to the room we're going to meet in, while that's happening, you've been shut out of the system. You cannot enter the system. Okay. We sit down, Charlie, thank you for meeting with me. I appreciate everything you've done with the company. It's not a good fit. You and the company are not a good fit. You're very talented in many areas, and I want to give you an opportunity to pursue your greatest strengths. And then I hand you a check that I already signed. I said, Charlie, that check is everything you're owed through the end of today. Let's say we're meeting at 10 in the morning. Then I'm going to say to you, Charlie, I'm going to help you any way I can. So whatever you do next, whatever you decide to pursue next in your career path, you can ask the person you're meeting with to call us, and we will say nice things about it. And so I've now given you a check. It's signed. You're paid to the end of today. And I say, Charlie, you can leave after this meeting, or you can stay in the office. We paid you through the end of today. If you decide to stay in the office, you can talk to anyone you want to talk to.
What about severance? Would you pay severance?
And then after I say all of that,
Okay.
then I have another check that is not signed. And next to it is a one sentence letter. It's one sentence. It isn't even a letter. It's like on the top, it says resignation. It says, I, Charlie Garcia, have decided to resign my position at Corporate Creations effective immediately because I've decided to pursue other career opportunities, period. That's all it
One
says.
sentence. Okay.
There's no lawyer language in there. There's
And it
no
has their
release
name and a
language.
line to sign. There's
There's a
no
line with
legalese.
your name on it that's dated. So I say to Charlie, if you decide to sign this resignation, I'm going to sign this other check to say thank you and to help you. And in 30 years, I had one person not sign the resignation. One person.
And did you have some formula in terms of what the amount was,
It would
or was
depend
it?
on how long the person had been with us. The longer we did this, the better we got at it. And we
Right.
got to a point where we could identify people who were not a good fit within 30 days. But we were not as good at this at the beginning. And this is
Right.
a process of refinement and learning.
Right. But even if it was 30 days or
It could have been 2 days. I mean, if my leadership team identified you as toxic in 2 days, first of all, no one will say to you you're toxic. We're not going to have that conversation.
right, right,
We're just going to say it's not a good fit.
right,
We're going to give you at least 2 weeks.
right. So yeah, most companies don't do that, but that's again the golden rule. You're treating them respectfully.
Because you know why? You know whose fault it was that we hired a toxic person? It's our fault. It's not your fault.
Right, right, because you didn't do the diligence, you didn't check. They right. So then you get better over time. So that is one of the great things. You created a great work environment. Talk to us also about, and I want to hear this story again, because when you hire corporate people in your company, those and senior management that come from big corporations, they always want to have a budget, and you got to submit your budgets before the end of the year, and then you have a budget. How are you doing against the budget and the plan? And you don't believe in budgets. Tell us about that and why that's worked for you.
But budgets are an act of creative writing. I think budgets are useless in any organization I've ever been affiliated with, whether I control it or not. I share this opinion. We always measured year to date performance compared to last year. So, what's more important than a budget is growth. And I've told you my growth objective, 15% a year. That was my growth objective. I didn't have a 50% growth objective because I thought that was stressful. And it's hard to maintain culture when you're growing that fast. So my company, our goal was 15%. Sometimes we grow less, sometimes we grow double, right?
Instead of having a budget, if you said, okay, there's 12 months, I want to grow 15% a year, so you have to grow on average a certain amount.
So when I would look at my financials every month, I was always looking. So let's say today was the end of May, okay, and I'm looking at the financials from January 1 to the end of May. So I'm always going to compare those financials, and next to it will be a column showing me January to the end of May for last year. And then I have a column that shows me percentage growth. So my goal is to always compare last year to this year. And a budget is unnecessary because if you have a growth target and if you can achieve growth in the business, then the budget is useless. It wastes energy.
Right, but you also overlay that because you want to also make sure that your expenses are also, you're also very focused on profits on a monthly and yearly basis as well, and you're comparing that year to year too, right?
Yes, so I'm looking at a profit and loss statement and
Because
gives
you're
me
about cash flow.
I ran my company on a cash basis. So I'm comparing my profit and loss statement year to date, comparing this year to last year. I'm looking at all the line items in the profit and loss statement, including all my operating expenses. And the very first number I look at is the bottom line net profit growth. So I'm looking at the net year to date. How's my net profit for the first 5 months of the year comparing to the net profit for the first 5 months of last year? Did that number go up or down? If the number went up, and if it went up a lot, I'm going to pay a little bit less attention to the operating expenses. But if that number went up less than I wanted it to, or if it went down, I'm going to dissect the operating expenses. And I'm going to look and then I'm going to look at the line items with the dollar number that has the greatest delta. And I'm going to focus on those line items. And wherever you haven't looked recently, you're going to find the problem.
And this is also because you said you're a simplifier, not a complicator.
Yes. I'm gonna try and get rid of the noise. So I'm not gonna spend energy on something if my year to date profit compared to last year grew 20%. I'm not going to spend energy looking at the operating expense line items. I don't
Right
need to.
now, Frank, if there was some tidal wave that came in from a competitor or regulatory change that in May you had a dramatic change from the year before. Let's say your growth and your profits were down 20% versus being up 15%. Then what would your approach be if you thought that this was going to affect your business for the rest of the year?
Well, that only happened to me once in 30 years, and it was the global financial crisis. So the global financial crisis, my company, for the only time in its roughly 30-year history when I was the owner, um, had failed to achieve growth.
This is
And
07, 08, 09 timeframe.
yes, yes. So
And then,
16.
and
Yep.
right. And so how did you handle that? Or if you're talking in general to other people that have a startup right now or have a company and are
Right.
facing that,
So the way
what
I handled that is I stopped paying myself and I retained all earnings. I literally stopped paying myself. Now, why could I do that? Because I've always lived below my means. Even now, I live below my means. Because I get pleasure out of experiences, not things. And so I stopped paying myself. I did not cut anyone's pay. I did not stop paying bonuses because I paid a team bonus every month. And I started watching all my operating expenses very carefully. And we made this a company-wide project to cut to the bone all the operating expenses. We got rid of all the things that weren't necessary. And what happens is you grow businesses, you forget about something that is kind of an automatic pilot, and it's a relatively small number, and you forget about it. But
They add
when you
up.
go through a global financial crisis, you cut that and you start. And so we were able to actually, even during the global financial crisis, we were able to be in a position where we didn't grow, but we didn't shrink. So by the end, when I started seeing the numbers and we started focusing on cutting expenses to the bone, and I stopped paying myself, I'm the only one who stopped paying himself. Everyone else got paid. It sends a cultural message to the team.
Now, let me ask you, there's some companies that wait for the end of the year, and if they're profitable and they make good decisions and they're going to bonus people based on, the value and how much, influence they have with the company and all that.
Those bonuses
You,
are useless. And they're useless because most people do not have a 10-year time horizon like I do. Now, there's exceptions, but I view the world in decades. Most people view the world in months.
so what did you do? What made your company very different? And I think transparency is also a big kind of cultural thing that you were able to
The first thing you do is you accept reality as it is presented to you, not as you hope it exists. And so it is a truism that most people do not view the world in decades. And most people don't view the world in years either. So why are you going to bonus every year? You're not motivating people because then they start to view that as an entitlement. And when people view a bonus as an entitlement, it stops motivating them. So what we did is we bonus every month. We created what's called a team bonus, and the bonus had two columns. People who were salaried all got the same bonus, and people who were hourly all got the same bonus. It wasn't a percentage of what they made, so it made the calculation of the number very simple.
what would the average monthly be for those two categories?
Well, so if you were hourly, you were probably making 40 to 50,000 a year, right? If we took your hourly number across
Right.
the whole year, this is going back 5
A long
years,
time ago.
6
Okay.
years. Okay, the number now would be a little higher, and then your bonus by the time,
Per month.
yes, by the point in this story, right? Because I had people who stayed with me a long time, and they all
Right.
benefit from the growth of the business.
Sure.
So the bonus could be half of that income.
So on a monthly basis, what could I expect?
Well, so if you were making 50,000, half of 50,000 is 25,000. You're making that as a salary. And then every month you're going to get a bonus on one of your checks, and you're going to divide 25,000 by 12 months. So you're going to get a $2,000 bonus.
So on a monthly basis, I'm getting I'm getting a salary, but
You're getting,
I'm getting an extra 2,000 comes in as a,
so now you're making 50 grand a year. And that number keeps going up, right? Because my company grew, with the exception of the global financial crisis where we were flat for 1 year. We grew every year for almost 30 years.
right, right. Okay. So now tell me about the other category of
Well,
people.
if you were salaried, which tended to be my executive team, so my chief financial officer, my
Let's say a
chief
guy's
marketing officer,
making
CEO, my
somebody's
salespeople,
right. Let's say they're making 100,000 a year.
or
What
more,
would they,
or
right.
more. Okay.
So 150, what could they, so they're getting, let's say to keep it easy, they're getting 10,000 a month. So they're 120,000 a year as a salaried employee on your leadership team. What could they expect on a monthly basis?
Well, depending on where they were, because the higher paid people were making 75 to 300 in that range, 75,000 to 300 a year in that range. And so for them, it wouldn't be half, it might be 30%. So take somebody who was making 90, their salary is 60, and they're getting a bonus of 30,000 paid over 12 months. So they're making almost 3,000 a month.
Right. But if you hired somebody, typically, hey, you're going to be the VP of da da da, and your salary is going to be 120,000 a year, or, right?
No, we'd back into it. So their salary would be 90,
Okay.
and then you're going to get a bonus equaling 30 payable every month.
Oh, but that's only if you hit the numbers.
We always hit the number.
But how did you do
And
the
the number keeps
contract?
going up.
Right. But in the contract that you signed with them, it would say you're going to get 90 plus 30. You're going to get 120.
I didn't use contracts.
Okay, so
I
tell us about
use the
that.
emails.
All right,
I
so
use the
okay,
in other words,
and you're a Harvard lawyer, so I know there's a reason for all this. But what?
because contracts make people uncomfortable.
So what the email say?
The email would be a summary of what we discussed.
So hi, Charlie.
You're going to
So
make 90
walk me.
grand a year, payable 26 times a year. So 90 divided by 26, because there's 26 payrolls every 2 weeks. And then in addition to that, you're going to get a bonus on the 15th day on one of the checks in the month, which is going to be the 15th. So we paid the 15th and the 30th of every month. That's how we did it, 26 times a year. And on the 15th day of the month, in addition to the 90 divided by 26, you're going to get a bonus. And this is the historical number for the bonus. And the bonus has been going up for X number of years.
So then if I looked at that, I would say, okay, so my expectation, if I'm telling my significant other,
Is you'll
is
make 120.
that I'm going to make 120, but
And then you're going to talk to 5 people in the office
right,
and you're going to say to them, is this real? And they're going to say, it's real. Yeah.
right, and that piece is also growing 15% a year, right? But the salary is not like the 90 stays, right? But the 30 is
The
growing
base stays. The base stays. So in my company, we did not give raises. We didn't give raises.
because, and the reason you
We
didn't
did
give a
not have
raise,
we did not have scheduled employment reviews. So we had a thing called, we called it fun, corporate creations fun. It was an intranet. Only the members of the team could see this. And on there we had things like guidelines. We called it guidelines. We didn't call it rules. We called it guidelines. In the guidelines, we'd say, Charlie, this is how much vacation time you can take, depending how long you're here. Here's how the bonus program works. We'd have things like that. Charlie, if you decide you want to go to graduate school and get a PhD, we're going to if you give us 12 weeks notice, we're going to give you $4,000 and we're going to celebrate you at the monthly meeting. And if you change your mind and you don't get the PhD, you get to keep your job. Why do we do this? So that members of the team were not put in a position where you give no notice, which seems to be more and more common in today's society. You give no notice, and then it's hard to find a quality person to replace you.
but I want to go back to your rule of 72 that you were telling everybody about. If you're growing, you said 15% a year, the rule of 72, more or less, in 5 years, that's going to double. So if I'm making 90 and 30 and I stay with you 5 years, then that 30 would become 60.
No, the bonus program didn't work that way. The bonus program had a schedule.
Okay.
And so for any level of realized gross profit, you knew the bonus you would make if you were salaried or if you were hourly. And
So it never grew. So if you're at
it
90,
did grow, but not at that rate that you're describing.
so if I'm getting 90 and 30, what would the 30 grow?
So I reverse engineered a profit sharing program of 5%. That's the easiest way to think about it. So I essentially said, I, as an owner, and I owned 94% of my company, and the other 6% was owned by someone who was with me almost from the beginning, who was my brother's classmate at USC Law School, a guy named Louis Uriarte. So I controlled the company on 94%. I said, I want to have the most motivated team in the country. And this is how we're going to defeat the two predators. And I'm going to give 5% as the company grows. I'm going to give away 5% to my team.
Right. So they're making basically, but it's also they could consider I'm getting a 5% raise every year, right? It's the other
No, it
way
could
to
be
look at
higher.
it.
It's 5% of all profits of the company.
I see. So and then you distribute that
It's
to
as
the
if though they
entire
were
team.
owners of the business. It's as if though my team owned 5% of the business.
Okay. So and then that also helped you if you had people say, "Hey, I want to own equity. If get bought out, I want to have equity." This
Yes.
also helped you say you you've already accounted for that, right?
Yes. So sometimes people use the word shadow stock.
Right.
So I created informally a version of shadow stock by creating about a 5% profit bonus program. And it was effective because it got paid every month. It always got paid because remember when during the time when we were flat, I stopped getting paid.
Right. But if some company did adopt that and for whatever reason they didn't make money they weren't profitable for a couple of years, and that may not work.
They would have to refine the process.
Right.
They
It
would
worked
have
for
to.
you because you created very strict things and were very disciplined at the beginning to shoot for that minimum of 15% growth of revenues, of profits on a yearly
Yeah, and what I
basis.
did is difficult to implement in a very volatile industry. So some industries have 5 good years and 5 bad years, and my industry was not like that. So
It was
what
very sticky. Once somebody's doing this, it's a pain to move registered agents, and it was very sticky over time. And your clients never control more than like 1% or 2%.
No, less than that. We had 15,000 accounts when I sold the company. We had none of our clients were more than 50 basis points of revenue. So I had a very diversified income stream across 3 recurring incomes with 15,000 accounts. But more important than stickiness, because my company did not use contracts. Anybody could switch the registered agent to one of my competitors. And so the reason they didn't switch was not because it was sticky. The reason they didn't switch is we had the best team in the United States. I had the most motivated team in the country because they felt like they owned the business. My team felt like they were owners of the business. We published all our realized gross profit numbers every month. Whenever anybody would resign, we'd celebrate them at the next meeting.
I like that. So do you mind if I ask you something personal?
Sure.
So you had a brother that worked with you and you had a great relationship, but as it is with family, it can be complicated too. Tell us about that and how that had a big impact in your life. What happened there?
I founded Corporate Creations in 1993. My brother was a USC Law School graduate, 3 years younger than me, and we also have a sister who's 6 years younger than me. I'm the oldest. Very close to my brother. Smart guy, very charismatic. Graduated from USC Law School. Worked at a firm in Miami called Schuss and Bowen, and did not like working in a law firm, just like I didn't like working at a law firm. And had been working less than a year, and I had just started Corporate Creations in January 1993. And so in October 1993, he joined Corporate Creations as employee number 2. And he ran the business from a folding table in his apartment, and I ran it from a folding table in my house in a guest room. And he did very well at the beginning.
Did you cut him in any equity or anything
Yes,
like
my
that?
brother. Yes, he did very well in the first 2 years, and we were growing the business a lot together. And he owned 40% of the business with a vesting schedule. He had a vesting schedule. He had only vested maybe 10% at the time of this part of the story. And then my brother started to underperform substantially.
That's
I
tough when you have members of the family in the business.
Yeah, so he excelled the first 2 years. He had a
Right.
vesting schedule of 40%. He invested maybe 10% of that. At that point in time, Lewis was only an employee at that point in time. My brother started to underperform. And he started to underperform in part because he suffered from depression, although at the time I didn't know that. And his depression was biochemical, not situational. People either depressed because something bad happens, or they're depressed because their body doesn't release enough happy hormones, endorphins. My brother was in the second category, but I didn't know it because he was very charismatic. And so he masked it. And I don't think he knew it, right? I don't think he understood what was happening. But he was underperforming enough that I had to move him from the business. So this is before the invite to resignation thing that I started doing. But at this point in time, he'd been with me 4 years, roughly.
And could you still do the principal negotiation with the family member with all the emotions?
No, I had to fire him.
Mm, okay.
Because he was dealing with personal dynamics that were
Right,
complicated.
right.
Um, And I tried to work around these problems for 2 years. I made some bad decisions. For example, I vested him completely. I eliminated the vesting schedule. I did that because I loved him.
Yeah.
I thought that would help him. But but we went through 2 years. So we had 2 magical years and then 2 very difficult years. And I was a young father. My wife had quit her job as a lawyer. We were raising our family, and it was getting, I felt like I was working 2 jobs. I was working my job and his job, not every day, not every week, but that's what it was starting to feel like. And so I drove down to Miami Beach where he was living at the time. I lived up in Palm Beach County, Palm Beach Gardens, I think at the time. I drove down to Miami Beach in the morning. I left early. I knocked on his door at 8 in the morning. He opened the door. I hugged him. I kissed him on the cheek. I told him I loved him, and I fired him. As you can imagine, he reacted in a very emotional way to this experience. I tried for 2 years to create a more principled negotiation kind of outcome, but I
Yeah,
couldn't
there was
figure
a
out,
chemical. There was something chemical going on. Neither of
and I
you
couldn't
knew it was
figure out how
going
to
on.
solve the problem. And
Right.
the problem was starting to affect my own life. So I remember I had vested in him, so he had
Right.
vested, and so I gave him a fair buyout, and he lived on that buyout for 9 years. And in year 9, he died. He had an accident kayaking the Zambezi River in Africa. He was a whitewater kayaker. He was a world-class snowboarder. And so the way he lived for 9 years after this experience is he engaged in extreme sports like whitewater kayaking and snowboarding.
And it probably did something chemically,
It
I'm
it
sure.
allowed him to enable him to manage his depression so that he could get out of bed.
Did you guys ever reconcile?
We reconciled 3 years before he died, approximately 3 years before he died. He was angry with me for 6 years, 7 years, but we would write to each other, but he wouldn't write to me. He was literally writing to me, but he would not address his messages to Frank. He would address his messages to Dylan. And Dylan is my oldest son. And Dylan and my brother were born the same day. Their
Wow.
birthday's the same day. So he felt the connection. And Dylan was a little kid. So when Dylan was 8 years old, my brother wrote to Dylan, but to my email address, and invited Dylan to go snowboarding with him in Ushuaia, Argentina. Now, my brother knew I wasn't going to send my 8-year-old to Argentina by himself.
And what was the birthday?
June 27th. Yeah.
Wow.
So Dylan and my brother uh, were really the way I reconnected with my brother, and I invited my parents. So I wrote back to my brother, and when I would write to him, sometimes I would say, "I shared your invitation with Dylan, and Dylan, mom and dad, and I are going to visit you in Argentina."
That's fun. And which of your sons is the rock climber?
Dylan,
Okay, so he
Dylan
got
is
the
he's more of a boulder, what's called bouldering.
okay.
Yeah. He's a second degree black belt in Taekwondo. He's a black belt in Kung Nu, which is Vietnamese, and he has a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu.
He's very disciplined, for sure.
Very disciplined. When our boys were growing up and we were sitting around the dinner table, we told our boys that they were required to play a sport because playing a sport teaches resilience.
Resilience, sure.
Because in sports you lose a lot. Even if you're great, you lose a lot, right? And you lose as a team, and sometimes you lose individually because you blow the play that causes you to lose the game or it causes you to lose the match. And so we told our boys, you can play any sport you want. It could be team or individual, but you will play a sport. And so Dylan, the oldest, started with baseball. He was terrible. Soccer, just as bad. And then one day says, "Hey, I don't really like these sports. I want to try martial arts." And then that's what ended up being his sport. Now he's a rock climber, so he does those
Right,
indoor walls. So he does
right,
indoor
right.
rock climbing and he does bouldering, and he also does yoga. And then the little one, the younger one, who's 4 years younger, um, he's an amazing swimmer, and he swims water polo style. So head up. The water polo players swim head up so they can see the ball. He's an amazing swimmer, and by the time he became a teenager, he was a pretty good soccer player.
Wow. Well, we've talked a lot about financial, we've talked about social, we've talked about emotional, but we haven't really gone into intellectual much in that having this kind of growth mindset and reading and growing your mind. And we talked about some of the books that are important, but how do you keep your curiosity alive and that kind of growth mindset as you've aged and throughout your life?
I'll be 62 in October. I sold my business over 5 years ago in February of 2020. I've been semi-retired since the age of 41. And let me explain what that means. When my brother died uh, on April 8th, 2005, he died 20 years ago. I stopped working. The day he died, I stopped working. I didn't work for 14 months. And during the 14 months that I stopped working, my team set a record in profits without me.
Wow.
And so I never went back to work. So I had created a culture that enabled this to happen. At the time, I didn't realize I had created this culture, but it turns out that that's what helped this outcome to be achieved. And so I've had an intellectual curiosity uh, almost my entire life. That intellectual curiosity got beaten out of me in law school because, much like boot camp for anyone who has a military background, in boot camp, you don't want to stick out. So you don't want to be curious. You don't want to ask questions. That was my experience in law school, and it was counter to my instinct. My instinct was to be curious and ask questions, but it gets beaten out of you because you get beat up enough that you
Right.
realize you don't want to stick out that way. So with that exception of kind of toning down my curiosity during law school, I've always been very curious. I ask questions. I like talking with people. I like learning from others. I like watching films. I like reading. Um, so that's how I feed my curiosity. I like to mentor people. So I have informal relationships with people. They tend to be younger than I am. And I don't charge for this. I do it for free. It's usually informal, and I like paying it forward. I like talking to younger people, oftentimes in the business arena because that's an area where I have expertise as an entrepreneur, but not limited to that. So these are all ways that I feed my curiosity and my intellectual.
Just something that just came to mind is Adam Grant wrote a book about givers and takers. And I know you and I have had conversations around the giver and taker philosophy. Can you talk about that and how that's impacted you?
So I'll share an anecdote to illustrate the giving taking paradigm. 1 year after my brother died, my sister called me and she was angry with me. I said, "Why are you angry with me?" And she said, "I'm angry with you because there's something wrong with you." And I said, "Well, what does that mean? What do you mean there's something wrong with me?" And she said, "Well, what's wrong with you is that I've been falling apart for a year and there's nothing wrong with you. So what's wrong with you is that there's nothing wrong with you, and that's weird. And so I'm angry with you." And I said to her, "Are you willing to follow my advice so you can stop being angry?" And she was skeptical. She didn't believe me. She said, "Okay, well,
How many
Frank,
years younger was
young,
she?
6 years younger, and there's the dynamic of the older
Yeah.
brother, and there's that dynamic." But she said, "Okay, well, I'll listen to your advice, and then I'll decide whether I'm going to follow it or not." I said, "Okay, well, every day, do three things: feed your mind, feed your body, and feed your soul. Feed your mind every day. Have an interesting conversation like you and I are having now, Charlie. Read a book, watch a film, feed your body, exercise almost every day. Maybe you're going to do it 6 days, 5 days, but you're going to exercise almost every day. And it doesn't matter what you do. You can go for a walk, you can rollerblade, you can go ice skating. It doesn't matter what you do, but you have to move. Your body has to move. You can do calisthenics. Okay. Feed your soul. So feed your mind, feed your body, feed your soul.
And you told her to do this for how long?
I told her to do this for her whole life. I said to her, well, try it for a week. I mean, she may have said to me, well, how long have you been doing this? And I said, I've been doing this my whole life. Feed your body, feed your mind, feed your soul. It's just intuitive to me. So why don't you do that and get back to me in a week and tell me if it's bullshit. Let me know if you believe it. Okay. So what does she do? That week, every day she read, she'd watch a film, she'd talk with her husband. Every day she'd go rollerblading, and she volunteered at a cancer ward for children with cancer. She called me up a week later. Frank, you're right. I didn't think you were right, but you're right. I now understand why you haven't fallen apart. And she told me what she did. And she says something very interesting. She said, the one I was most skeptical about was to feed your soul. And I explained it to her this way. I said, the way you feed your soul is you have to do something for someone else who cannot pay you back. If they pay you back, it's a transaction. If you give them a discount, it's a transaction. If they cannot pay you back. And then it feeds your soul. So what she was the most skeptical about was she thought that when she went to the hospital, that she was there for the kids.
She would think of your brother. Yeah. She maintained that?
No.
No.
Well, she did for a year, and then she did it in a less disciplined way. It helped her. It helped her deal with the death of my brother. And it turned out that she thought she was there for the kids, but the kids were there for her.
Right. Right.
They made her happy.
Because she was helping them, serving others. But you and I have, I call you up and say, hey, Frank, do you know about, this person, or what do you think? And you would say, oh, he's a giver, good person. But sometimes you'd say, hey, he's a taker, or sometimes say he's a I forget, he's a matcher, like tit for tat kind of person. And you tend to gravitate, to givers because we're givers.
Yeah, and the world is a little more complicated than that, right? I mean, people can be
Right.
givers some of the time and not others. So I try not to be judgmental about it, but we all know a taker when we see them, right? So, sometimes people vacillate between matcher and giver, and that's okay.
Right.
I don't have a problem with that, with anyone on that spectrum. I have a problem with people on the spectrum between matcher and taker. Those are the people I have a problem with. And the way I deal with that problem is I don't interact with them. I mean, once I've identified them, I just basically, they don't exist to me.
You've taken care of your body, your mind. You never been a big alcohol person. You don't.
My nickname is Two Drink Frank.
Yeah. So tell me about how you keep, and throughout your 20s till to now, you've kept your body and mind healthy.
Well, I think if you embrace the golden rule, and if you try and live by its principles, and if you exercise most days of the week.
And you were mostly a runner, right?
I was a runner for 40 years.
So you would jog and go out and run every day?
Yeah, I would run 5 to 7 days a week. I'd run 2 to 3 miles, 20 to 30 minutes. And then I did other things. I did push-ups, and I would bench press, but not heavyweight, just for muscle tone. I transitioned from running, and I'm not a tall person. I'm 5'7".
Right.
I'm not a heavy person, so I was able to run for 40 years. But I'll be 62. When you hit 59, 60, your body starts to heal less quickly, and so on.
Right.
And so I'm now a walker. So I now walk for 50 minutes. Instead of running for 20, I walk for 50 minutes. I did that this morning. I went walking for 50 minutes, and I usually walk in the morning.
You also, you talk about win friend and influence people, Dale Carnegie. I can't remember any interaction with you where you haven't had a big smile. I mean, sometimes you're pensive in your thinking, but in general, you're smiling, you're happy, you're a joyful person, you radiate energy, and I don't know if that's the way you always were from a little kid, or is it something that you learned over time?
I think when I was younger, I was quieter. And my parents are refugees from Cuba. While they spoke English when they came to the United States on my freedom flights in 1962, we only spoke Spanish at home, even though they learned English because they learned English before they came to the United States. And they didn't want me to learn English with their accent. They had very strong accents in English. And so, because we only spoke Spanish at home, when I started kindergarten in Indianapolis, I didn't speak a word of English. And I think in the first few years of my life, because I didn't have a command of the English language, I tended to be a listener, and which later in life has helped me because listening is an underrated skill. And when I listen very actively. Some people tune out what the other person is saying because they're busy preparing what they're going to say next. And I'm a very active listener. And I think I started to develop those skills when I was 5 because I had to figure out what the hell everybody was saying.
Right,
It
right,
didn't
right.
speak English. And now I learned English probably in 3 months, but my vocabulary over time became more extensive in English. And so in terms of radiating energy, I think what happened to me was, a series of evolutions where I was very quiet. I tended to be shy. I think the story I just told is one theory on why that was that evolution at that stage. And then as I got older, I
If
started
you're
to,
knocking on doors with your dad, I mean, that takes courage too, to be like knocking on doors and
well,
smiling at
I was
people.
watching my dad because I wasn't an
Right,
employee then. He would invite me and say, "Look, why don't you
right,
watch what I do?" And then I started to do it, but unofficially without being an employee. And then I said, "Oh, okay, well, this is a good way to make some money." It was better than working at the JCPenney gas station, which is
right,
what JCPenney used to have gas stations. I used to work at the gas station, and this was better. So I evolved from being kind of a listener and quiet and figuring out how to speak English to then getting to high school, playing sports. I was a baseball player. That was my primary sport. I was a very bad player when I started. And by the time I was a teenager, I was an all-star. I made the junior varsity team at my high school, which was difficult because my high school won the state championship for many consecutive years in baseball. We were a sports dynasty. I didn't
wow,
make it to the varsity team because a lot of those guys ended up becoming professional baseball players, and I was good, but I wasn't that good. When I was in 10th grade, I would challenge myself to do things that made me uncomfortable, and I was still relatively shy, but I ran for class president when I was a junior in high school. So I
wow,
ran for class president and I won. I beat the incumbent. And then when
wow,
I was a senior in high school, I ran for class president again as an incumbent because I was the junior class president.
right,
But I ran against the most popular guy in high school who was the football quarterback, and I beat him. I'm not sure how I did that, but so I beat the football quarterback when I was a senior shot, and then I used to do the pep rallies. So this guy named Tim Gannon. Tim Gannon was this very colorful character who had a little radio show. So my high school had like a radio
right.
platform with a radio show and a television closed circuit. And this guy was well known for doing that. And so he and I would do the pep rallies together. Um, and then another transformational moment for me was um, I was in law school and I didn't like law school. And my girlfriend at the time, who's my wife, who I've been with for 43 years, and she's a very important part of my life. And whatever glow you see, a lot of that is emanating because of the special relationship that I have with her. She's my best friend. She's the smartest person I've ever met. And so when I was in law school, my relationship with Kelly with an N, had become complicated. I wasn't happy in law school. She wasn't happy in law school. When you're not happy, it's hard to be happy with who you're with. And we're both stubborn, so we stuck it out. We never broke up, but it was hard. It was a very complicated time in a relationship. And I made a decision after my second year of law school that instead of starting to work, so when a lot of students who were in law school in the summer, they work a summer clerkship, and my wife and I had summer clerkships after every summer, and I had a clerkship at the same firm that I clerked at after my first year, firm that at the time was called Steele Hector and Davis. And I talked to the managing partner because I had already worked there one summer. And I said, hey, thanks for giving me an offer to work again the second summer after my second year. And I'm going to travel and ride trains in Europe for a month. I'm going by myself. Ellen didn't want to go with me. And he said, yeah, sure. So instead of working for 3 months, you're going to work for two. We'll pay you for the 2 months you work. So you can work July and August, and in June, have fun in Europe. And so that European trip was one of the most transformational experiences of my life because it forced me out of my tendency to be shy. And anyone who's known me for the last 40 years would never describe me as shy. I'm the opposite of that. But that I was very shy until I was in my mid-20s. Very shy. And in Europe, when you're shy and you're by yourself and you're there for a month and you don't know anybody, it gets really lonely. And so it, and then I figured out that to avoid being lonely, I could just start talking to people and nothing bad. Right?
That's great.
Because I think sometimes when you're shy, you're afraid you're going to say the wrong thing. You're afraid you're not going to be interesting, or I'm not quite sure what the mindset was, but I was very shy, even though I had forced myself to run for class president and I did the pep rallies and right. These are not things that a shy person usually does. But then the real transformation happened when I took this trip to Europe, and it took me a few days. I mean, I remember being in the French Riviera in Cannes, sitting on a seawall, surrounded by beauty, and I was lonely. And I made the decision on that seawall that that was going to stop. And that if I was on a train, or I'll give you an anecdote, right? So I'm on a train. I'm going from um, Salzburg to Vienna. I'm in Austria at this point. So I made
Right.
myself, I worked myself all the way from England. I'm now in Austria. I've been riding trains for a long time, right? And sometimes I would stand in between the trains. I used to have a backpack. I had a little pack in the front, like students use in college, to balance me. And my luggage was my backpack. And I would stand in between the trains because it was fresh air. And I'm standing in between the trains, and there's this Austrian guy. And he was such a joyful guy. So we're about to get to where he's going to get off. And I say to the guy, you're the happiest guy that I've ever met. And he starts crying. And I'm in my mid-20s. I had spent most of my time being shy. For many weeks now, I had been doing this sort of thing of just randomly talking to people. This guy starts crying, right? And so I say, well, what's wrong? And he says, well, my father is dying. And he said he was visiting him in the hospital, and he hugs me and he puts money in my pocket. And I say, what's that for? And he says, when you get to Vienna, you're going to arrive at a train station. And most people don't know that at the top of this train station is a beer garden. And that beer garden has the best views in all of Vienna. And when you get to the train station, I want you to take that money that I just gave you, and I want you to invite someone to a beer, and I want you to do a toast to me and my father.
Wow. And how did you find somebody? Like, how did you pick somebody to do that with?
So I walk out of the train and I see a young couple. I introduce myself. I tell them this story. They accept my invitation. They were from Vienna. They lived it. They were Austrian. They spoke English. And a lot of the people, a lot of Europeans speak fluent English. And we go up to the beer garden. It had the best views of Vienna. And Vienna is beautiful because all the roofs are made of copper, and all the copper has turned green over hundreds of years. Back during this story, which was 40 years ago, there were no high rises in Vienna. I mean, the tallest buildings were 2, 3 stories. I'm in the beer garden of the train station looking down on all of this beauty. And so I invite them for a beer. And guess what happens after we have our beer? They invite me to dinner. And so I had experiences like this for 3 weeks. So I had that 1 week where I was, I was,
Lonely.
I was lonely because I'm by myself. And then I
Right.
start to put myself out there, and I had a lot of cool experience. I just gave you one of many anecdotes of experiences that I had.
I want to ask you about when you were hitchhiking in Greece. We'll save that one
Well,
for another
I was hitchhiking in Italy,
Italy.
in a beach town in Italy. Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I got picked up by somebody who wanted to give me more than a ride.
So, but you were an adventure, and you just put yourself out there, and the synchronicity of life just put interesting people in front of you, and then that lesson transformed you in a way that you were just fearless from just meeting people and
And
seeing
that
what the
started in
universe.
Europe. It
Oh,
started in Europe.
wow.
Well, Charlie, you look, the first time you met me was when I was the teacher.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the first time I met you was when you were a keynote speaker being recognized as a business leader of the year
I remember
at an
that.
event at the Breakers Hotel. There were 500 people in the room, and
And you came up to me.
I was sitting at a table with Rich DeVos, the co-founder of Amway, with Judge Camp, who was a prominent judge on the federal bench. I didn't know any of these people, and I didn't know you. And it turns out that Judge Camp's best friend is the father of a close friend of mine named Tom Bartle. And so because of that, Camp and I have connected because I'm friends with his best buddy's son. And Camp says to me, "Do you know Charlie Garcia?" And I say, "Why?" He goes, "Well, because I heard he wants to meet Rich DeVos." I said, "Give me a moment." I go and I don't know you. I didn't know who you were. So I go, this is before you spoke. So I literally didn't know who you were. And so I go to the person who invited me to the event and I said, "Hey, I'm sitting with Judge Camp and Rich DeVos, and who's Charlie Garcia?" Oh, well, he's our keynote speaker. He's being recognized as business leader of the year. Well, where is he? I don't know what he looks like. So he says, he's the guy at that table number 3 or whatever near the stage. And so I go back to the table. I'm chatting with Camp because I didn't like Rich DeVos very much. I found him to be a little standoffish, but I liked Camp a lot. And I said, Judge Camp, would you like to meet Charlie Garcia? And I can bring Rich DeVos with us. So the three of us walk over. Charlie doesn't know who I am. He doesn't know who Camp is. He knows who Rich DeVos is because he wanted to.
Totally forgot this
I
story.
introduce all these people to each other. I don't know any of these people, right? And then Charlie throws his credit card in my pocket. So, kind of like the Austrian who throws some money in my pocket so I can buy a beer for someone to celebrate the memory of the friendship that we had created and the memory of his father. Charlie throws a business card in my pocket, and that was the beginning of our friendship. And that happened only because I put myself out there, because I made connections between people who at the time I didn't know.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that one.
And you thought I knew these people. Like,
Yeah, sure. And
no,
actually was going to clerk for Rice Camp because he was on the appellate court. I had a district court clerkship in Miami. I forget, Judge Moreno. But then I decided not to practice law, so I gave that up. But Rice Camp he was an amazing a person and judge, and that's interesting. But before I leave you, I gotta, you mentioned, the importance of Kellen, and obviously you wouldn't have achieved the success without her. But what was the story about the glasses, or how you met her? Like, what was that about at the University of Miami?
I met Kellen the first week of college. I would sit in the front row of my classes because at the time, contact lens technology was not very good and they were uncomfortable. And so I wore glasses to be able to see the board. But if I sat in the front row, I didn't have to wear my glasses. And I didn't like wearing my glasses because the bridge of the nose and the ears, it made me uncomfortable. I didn't like it.
Right.
And so I usually would not wear my glasses. I would wear them to drive, so be safe. But if I sat in the front row, I could get away with it. Well, Kellen was sitting next to me in the front row. And the class started, and the way the class started was, so uh, I can be a smartass. So there was a scheduling conflict at the University of Miami, and the schedulers had put two classes in the same classroom at the same time. And so half the students in the classroom were standing up, and the two professors were trying to solve the problem. And so I raised my hand. I was in the front row, and I had just met Kellen, but I really didn't have a chance to talk with her very much, but I thought she was sexy. And I raised my hand and I said, Professors, I have a solution for the scheduling conflict because the honor students are superior. They should be permitted to stay in the classroom, and the other non-honor students should be required to leave. So everybody started laughing, right? Because it was I mean, obviously I didn't believe that. It was an exaggerated, I engage in hyperbole sometimes, and sometimes it's funny, and sometimes people think I have an offbeat sense of humor. So Kelly and I then have this class, and she's sitting next to me, and she had a low cut little thing, and she had a pendant. Like you can see this little chain I
Right.
had.
Right. Right.
Hers is kind of low cut like that. She had a little pendant, which at the time I thought was a bowl. So we go to lunch on the meal plan, and so I'm an economics major, so she was a cheap date. She all paid for her own lunch on the meal plan. I paid for my own lunch on my meal plan. We lived in dorms that were next to each other. We lived in the two towers near the intramural field. I was in one tower, she was in the other. And during lunch, she gave me her phone number, and that night I called her, and we were bantering. I grew up in an environment where people showed affection by bantering.
Right.
And I'm still like that to this day. And so I was bantering with her, and I said, I can read minds. And she says, No, you can't. I said, Yeah, I can read minds. Well, and think about your horoscope sign, and don't tell me what it is, but think about it. And when you've been thinking about it for a few seconds, I'm going to tell you what horoscope sign are. So she plays along. This is over the phone. She plays along. She goes, Okay, what's my horoscope sign? I said, You're a Taurus. She says, How the hell did you do that? I'm a Taurus. What are you? I'm a Scorpio. Okay. So the next morning, we agreed we would have breakfast together in the morning.
Right.
Again, at the meal plan, same cafeteria. So we had breakfast together, and I really liked her, and I wanted there to be full disclosure. So I wore my glasses because if she liked me, she had to like me
Right.
with the glasses. So I wear my
Right.
glasses, and she's sitting across the table from me, and I realized that what I thought was a bull was a unicorn. And I said to her, Hey, Kellen, first of all, I wore my glasses and this is why. And second of all, I can't read minds. I realized that the bull is actually a unicorn. She says, I didn't know why, but I knew you can't read minds.
Wow, that was funny. I want to end with I've kept you a long time, but I've learned a lot about you that I didn't know, and I thought I knew a lot. Um, we talked about religion, spirituality, but why are you here? Have you figured that out? Like, why is Frank Rodriguez in this world, and what are you here to
Well, so from
accomplish?
a cosmic standpoint, I'm agnostic. So as an agnostic, I don't know. Right. So an atheist says God does not exist. An agnostic says I don't know if God exists, and if God exists, I don't know the nature of God. And so I don't concern myself with those kinds of issues because I'm agnostic. I concern myself more with the golden rule
This isn't a question about do you believe or don't you believe. It's more a question of what what's your
of
purpose?
purpose. I mean, I think what gives people joy is helping others and feeding intellectual curiosity and having experiences. So, seeing my kids every month is about shared experiences, which you can't replicate over a phone call. Now, I talk to them every week, once a week. So for me, it's about shared experiences, intellectual curiosity. I feed that through films. Some weeks I go to the movies by myself. I'll watch a film in the theater. I go by myself.
Frank, I confuse passion and purpose. And I think passion are things that give you energy. Purpose is how you use your gifts for the benefit of others. And you're like an energizer bunny in a way. You have this energy and you help all of those around you. If I call you, you're going to go, or email you or text you, you're going to go out of your way to help me.
Well, that's part of my purpose.
Yeah, I think part of your
for
purpose.
me, those two things are the same.
Yeah.
For me, the purpose feeds the passion and the passion feeds the purpose, right? They're not, people would say to me, many years ago, people would say to me, what do you do in your downtime? And for me, this was a nonsensical concept. So what they were saying to me is, what do you do when you're not working? And for me, I say, well, I think you're looking at this wrong. It's all life. Work is part of that, right? So hopefully, eventually, when you're younger, you have less choices, but eventually, as choices open up to you and you make decisions that lead to a certain path, there's more congruity, there's more synchronicity between life and work, and they converge to where work is life and life is work. And work stops being a dirty word. It's just part of life. And so I view passion and purpose the same way. I don't distinguish between the two. And for me, it's about shared experiences. I get bored very easily. So one of the reasons I love to travel is I get bored much easier than my wife. My wife would just like to be in Jupiter all the time. But she recognized that I get bored easily and I love to travel. That's one of the things that's part of my passion, but it also feeds my purpose because when I'm traveling, I'll meet the Austrian who I have a special moment with, teaches me something, and creates a memory. So these things are all wrapped into each other.
Right. Well, as someone who's, has two sons, I can't wait until you have grandchildren.
I hope
a granddaughter, and you'll be able to take your granddaughter on a trip.
Yeah.
I think you're going to be an amazing grandfather because, at least in my life, my relationship with my grandfather was transformational. I think you're going to be an amazing grandfather when you have some rugrats to spoil.
So this will be interesting from the lips of an agnostic. So from your lips to God's ears.
Yes, but all things come in due time, so you can't, But any of your sons in a serious relationship?
Not currently. My oldest son was dating a girl, but that she got too serious too quick. I think she wanted to get married, and they had been together less than a year. He didn't feel that way about her. He liked her, but and so they're no longer together. And then my youngest son dated a girl for 2 years, and they broke up the night before the trip to Bhutan, which was interesting. And as parents, we would reserve our opinions to ourselves because the kids are going to do what they're going to do, and our job is to love them and support them. But I think that relationship played its course.
Well, I'll tell you a story. About a month ago, they were, in grade school, like preschool or whatever. They were asking all the kids who their friend was in class, and Johnny and Susan, whatever. And they came to my grandson, and he said, "Grandpa is my best friend."
Well, that's special. So, you're the grandpa, right?
Yeah. So that was pretty cool. It's a special thing. But anyway, last question is there anything that I didn't ask a question that you'd want to answer or leave the audience with in terms of you and wisdom that you may want to leave with them that I didn't ask?
Well,
That you
I'd
think
like
is
to
important?
emphasize that if anybody's going through a tough time in their lives, feed your body, feed your mind, and feed your soul, and everything will work out.
That's a great way to wrap up, and I want to thank you for your time. And I learned a ton, and I've known you for a long time. So thank you for being part of this, and I look forward to breaking bread with you again soon.
All right, Charlie. Good spending time with you.